Ferry was late, and my knees were already aching from standing on the dock for 40 minutes in the November wind coming off the strait. I remember checking my watch. Just past 2 in the afternoon. The crossing from Sauersen to Swartz Bay takes about an hour and a half on a good day, and this was not a good day. The fog had rolled in thick off the water, and BC Ferries had held us at the terminal with no explanation beyond a crackled announcement about marine visibility conditions. I had my duffel bag at my feet and a box of butter tarts from the bakery on Granville that my daughter had loved since she was small. They were wrapped in wax paper and tied with kitchen twine because that's how her mother used to do it, and some things you don't stop doing just because the person who taught you is gone. My name is not important. What I am is a retired civil engineer, 68 years old, widower of 11 years, and a father who drove, or in this case sailed, a considerable distance to spend Thanksgiving with his only child. I should tell you something about myself before I tell you what happened, because otherwise you might not understand why what I heard that evening broke something in me that I am still, even now, piecing back together. I grew up in Prince George, the son of a man who worked at the pulp mill and a woman who stretched every dollar so far it was practically transparent. We were not poor exactly, but we were careful. My father wore the same 3 flannel shirts for 15 years. My mother cut coupons at the kitchen table every Sunday morning like it was a religious practice, which, for her, I suppose it was. I learned from them that money is not a personality, it is a tool, and if you are fortunate enough to accumulate more of it than you need, the correct response is gratitude and discretion, not performance. I did well. I won't pretend otherwise. 35 years building infrastructure across British Columbia. A handful of key investments in the 90s and early 2000s that paid out in ways I did not fully anticipate, and a modest but well-chosen property portfolio that my late wife, Helen, helped me manage before her heart gave out at 57. I am comfortable in a way that would have made my father's jaw drop, but I still drive a 2009 Silverado that I have had serviced every 12,000 kilometers and refuse to replace because it runs perfectly well, and I have never seen the point of spending $40,000 to tell strangers something about myself that isn't their business. My daughter. I'll call her my daughter because that is what she is, and it is the only title that matters. Had moved to Victoria with her husband 3 years prior. He worked in finance. Commercial real estate on the island, he told people, though from what I could gather he mostly connected investors with developers and took a percentage for the introduction. I had tried to like him from the beginning. He was polished in a way that made me uneasy, the kind of man who knows exactly which wine to order and makes sure the waiter hears him order it. I told myself it was just generational. I told myself my daughter loved him. I told myself that was enough. They had a little girl. 2 years old at the time of that Thanksgiving. My granddaughter, I will call her my granddaughter, because she is mine in every way that counts, and whatever else I tell you about that weekend, she is not part of the ugliness. She is the only reason I stayed as long as I did. The ferry finally departed at 2:30. I stood on the outer deck for the first 20 minutes because I needed the air, even cold as it was. The strait was iron-grey and choppy, and the islands appeared and disappeared in the fog like something being slowly revealed. I thought about Helen. I thought about how she had made Thanksgiving every year without fail, the whole house smelling of sage and brown butter, my daughter as a teenager sitting on the counter picking at the stuffing when she thought her mother wasn't looking. I thought about how strange it is. Grief, how it doesn't diminish so much as it relocates. Some days it lives right behind your sternum, and you feel it with every breath. Other days it retreats to somewhere further back, and you forget about it for hours at a stretch. And then something small, the smell of butter tarts in wax paper, brings it rushing back up. I went inside and had a coffee from the cafeteria and read the newspaper someone had left on the seat. The markets were unsteady. There was a piece about the housing affordability crisis in Victoria. I read it twice because it described the neighbourhood where my daughter and her husband lived as one of the most expensive on the island, and I tried to calculate, not for the first time, how a man whose business I still didn't entirely understand could afford a 4-bedroom house 2 blocks from the water on the salary he'd vaguely described to me as doing well. I hadn't asked. I'm not a man who asks about other people's finances. I thought at the time that it was courtesy. Now I understand it was something closer to willful blindness. They picked me up from the Swartz Bay terminal in his car. A new one, I noticed, darker than the one he'd had in the spring. My granddaughter was in her car seat in the back, wearing a sweater with a moose on it, and she reached for me the moment I opened the door and said, "Pop," with complete conviction. And I held her small warm weight against my shoulder the whole drive into the city and didn't think about anything else. Their house was full of people I'd never met. My daughter had mentioned a dinner, just a small gathering, Dad, some friends from the neighbourhood, and I had not realised that small was doing significant heavy lifting in that sentence. There were easily 20 people in the open concept main floor when we arrived. Candles everywhere, the kitchen island covered in dishes that clearly had not been made from scratch. A bar cart near the window that someone had taken considerable trouble with. I changed out of my travel clothes upstairs in the guest room, which was tastefully decorated in a way that reminded me of a boutique hotel. Thick linen duvet, a diffuser on the nightstand emitting something that smelled like cedar. My duffel bag looked slightly embarrassed, sitting on the bench at the foot of the bed. I washed my face and went downstairs. My granddaughter had been taken upstairs to bed by a young woman I didn't recognize. A regular babysitter, my daughter explained. This was the first small deflation of the evening. I had imagined at least some time with the baby before dinner, but there were introductions to make, hands to shake, and my son-in-law was already steering me toward a cluster of men near the window with the particular efficiency of someone managing a social obligation. The men were pleasant enough. 2 of them were in real estate. One worked in wealth management. One had recently sold a tech company and was exploring his options. They asked what I did, and I told them I was retired, and something in my tone must have communicated that I preferred not to elaborate, because the conversation moved on, and I was grateful for it. I slipped away to refill my water glass around 7 o'clock. The kitchen was temporarily empty. The caterers, because there were caterers, I had realized by this point, were moving efficiently between the kitchen and the dining area, and there was a brief lull. I was standing at the sink when I heard my daughter's voice from the hallway, just around the corner. She was talking to her husband. The tone was low and quick, the tone people use when they've stepped away from a party to say something they don't want overheard. I should have announced myself. I knew that, but something in the cadence of it made me still. "He brought butter tarts," she said. Not warmly. "Of course he did," her husband's voice. A short sound, almost a laugh. "He still thinks I'm 12 years old." A pause. "He came all the way from Vancouver with butter tarts and a bag that looks like he dug it out of a storage unit." "Did he say anything about the transfer?" Silence. "No," she said, "not yet. He needs to. The financing closes in 6 weeks, and if we don't have that bridge loan confirmed, this whole thing collapses. I don't care how he structures it, gift, loan, whatever he wants to call it. We need $700,000, and the only person who can write that check without blinking is standing in our kitchen." "I know." "Then work on it tonight. That's why we invited him. That's why we're doing all of this." "I know," I said. A brief silence. Then my son-in-law said something that I felt in my back teeth. "He's going to leave it all to her anyway. Might as well be useful now." I stood at that kitchen sink for what felt like a long time, but was probably 45 seconds. My water glass was in my hand. The tap was still running. I reached out and turned it off. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It was not shock, exactly. There had been signals I had either missed or chosen not to examine, the phone calls over the past year that always arrived just before a major expense. The kitchen renovation, the new car, the holiday in Portugal they'd mentioned casually. The way my son-in-law's interest in our conversation sharpened whenever the topic of my finances came near. The way my daughter had started prefacing certain requests with, "I know you've done well, Dad," in a tone that did not sound like pride. I had attributed it to circumstance, to the cost of living, to the pressures of raising a child and maintaining a lifestyle in one of the most expensive cities in the country. I had been wrong. What I felt standing at that sink was grief, more than anything. Not for myself, or not only for myself. I felt it for the small girl upstairs in the moose sweater who did not yet know anything about any of this. And I felt it for Helen, for the particular mercy of her not being here to hear it. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel. I walked back out to the party. I smiled at the man from wealth management and accepted a small plate of charcuterie from a passing caterer and said nothing. But I had, in those 45 seconds at the sink, made a decision. The next morning I woke early. The house was quiet. I dressed and went downstairs and made myself coffee from the machine on the counter, a model I didn't recognize, the kind with pods. And I sat at the kitchen island and I called my lawyer in Vancouver. It was early on a Friday, but she picked up on the third ring because she's the kind of lawyer who picks up on the third ring, which is exactly why I hired her 20 years ago. I told her what I had heard. I told her what I needed. I told her I wanted it done properly, with documentation, and I wanted it completed before the end of the month. She said she would handle it. Then I sat there and drank my coffee and listened to the house begin to wake up around me, and when my granddaughter appeared at the bottom of the stairs in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes, she made a direct line for me as if navigating by some internal compass, and climbed up into my lap, and put her head against my chest, and that was that. I stayed through Thanksgiving dinner. I helped set the table. I carved the turkey because that was something I had always done and no one thought to stop me. I told a story about building a bridge in the Caribou in 1987 that made the man who'd sold the tech company laugh harder than I expected. I held my granddaughter on my hip through most of the dessert course and let her steal whipped cream from my plate. My daughter tried to raise the subject of money twice. Once over dinner, gently in the general vicinity of a conversation about interest rates. Once afterward, when we were stacking plates in the kitchen and her husband had conveniently disappeared. A more direct approach. "Dad, we've been meaning to talk to you about something. A potential investment opportunity that I think you'd actually find interesting." Both times I said, "Let's not talk about that this weekend. Let's just be here." Both times she let it go, because she didn't want to push too hard. Not yet. She was still hoping I didn't know. I left Sunday afternoon. My son-in-law drove me to the ferry terminal. We talked about hockey the entire way, specifically about whether the Canucks had any realistic chance of a decent playoff run, and we were both perfectly civil, and I wanted to ask him whether he thought I was a fool or whether he'd simply never considered the question. But I did not ask that either. He shook my hand at the departure's entrance. He thanked me for coming. He said they'd see me at Christmas. I said, "We'll see." He took that to mean yes. It did not mean yes. It did not mean yes. On the ferry home, I sat by the window and watched the island disappear behind me into the grey water, and I felt something settle inside me, a kind of cold clarity, the way the air feels after a hard frost. Not peace, exactly. Not yet. But something like resolve. My lawyer called the following Thursday. The estate restructuring was complete. My assets, the full picture, the investments, the property, the accounts, had been reorganized into a trust. A particular kind of trust, with a particular kind of trust, with a particular kind of beneficiary structure. My daughter was not removed. I am her father, and I love her, and I am not a man who acts in anger. But the trust was now administered independently, with specific conditions attached to any distributions, and my son-in-law's name appeared nowhere in the documentation. There was also a separate provision, established quietly and plainly, for my granddaughter's education and well-being. Irrevocable. No one could touch it, not even her parents, not until she turned 25. By then, I thought, she would know her own mind. She would be able to recognize the difference between people who loved her and people who needed something from her. I hoped so. I intended to have a hand in teaching her. The following week I called my daughter. She was warm on the phone, warmer than usual, which told me she had worked herself up to ask. We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, my granddaughter's new word, the weather, the hockey game, and then she took a breath and said, "Dad, I've been wanting to revisit that conversation we started at Thanksgiving." I let her go on for a moment. She was careful with her words. She said things like, "We've been exploring some opportunities, and your financial advisor could look it over, and of course there's no pressure." It was better prepared than I'd expected, actually. She had clearly rehearsed it. When she paused, I said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it." She went quiet. "I was in the kitchen on Thursday night," I said, "when you and your husband stepped into the hallway." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I heard my granddaughters babbling somewhere in the background. "Dad, I'm not calling to fight," I said. "I'm not angry, or rather I was, and I've moved through it, and now I'm calling to say this clearly so that we both understand. I know what this was about. I know why you invited me, and I know what he needs the money for." Another long silence. "I've spoken to my lawyer," I said. "I've reorganized my affairs. Everything is in order, and none of it is available for the purpose you've been discussing. That's not punishment. That's just the truth." I heard her breath catch. "What I want," I said, "is a relationship with my daughter and with my granddaughter that has nothing to do with my bank account. If that's possible, I'm here for it. If it isn't, if what I heard in that hallway is the whole of what we are to each other, then I think we need to be honest about that, and honest with ourselves," she cried. "Not strategically. I know her well enough to know the difference." She cried the way people cry when they've been caught, not in a lie exactly, but in a version of themselves they didn't mean to become. She said she was sorry. She said it had been his idea. She said she hadn't fully understood what he was planning to ask. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Whether all of it was true, I don't know. I suspect the truth is somewhere in the middle, the way it usually is. What I know is that she is my daughter, and she is the daughter of a woman I loved for 30 years, and I am not in the business of giving up on people I love, without at least leaving the door open. But I am also 68 years old, and I have learned, slowly and at some cost, that an open door is not the same thing as an unguarded one. Christmas came. I did not take the ferry. I invited them here instead, to the house in East Vancouver where my daughter grew up, where her bedroom still has the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling that she stuck up there in 1994 and that I have never had the heart to remove. She came. She brought my granddaughter. Her husband did not come. The official reason was a work obligation. I did not inquire further. We had butter tarts after dinner. My granddaughter ate hers in approximately 4 bites, and then looked at the remaining tarts with the serene confidence of someone who intends to have another. And I looked at my daughter, and she laughed, and for a moment, just a moment, she looked exactly like Helen. Same tilt of the head, same sound. I stored that moment somewhere I could find it again. We didn't talk about money. We didn't talk about her husband's deal, which I had since learned had fallen through regardless, the financing having collapsed for reasons entirely unrelated to me. I didn't say anything about that either. I didn't need to. What we talked about was Christmas. Old ones, mostly. We talked about the year the furnace went out on December 23rd and we spent 3 days in sleeping bags in the living room, with the oven cracked open, and played every board game we owned. We talked about the Christmases her mother was alive, and we talked about her without the careful avoidance we used in the years right after, and that was its own kind of healing. Before she left, she stood in the doorway with my granddaughter on her hip, and she said, "Dad, I'm sorry, not the way I said it on the phone, properly." I nodded. I kissed my granddaughter on the top of her head. "Come back soon," I said, "both of you." There are things I still don't know. I don't know what a marriage looks like from the inside, or what will become of it, or what she has said to him about that phone call. I don't know whether she came to that Christmas dinner out of genuine remorse, or something more complicated, and I'm not sure that distinction matters as much as I used to think it did. People are rarely entirely one thing. What I know is this: I spent 35 years building things meant to carry weight. Bridges, roadways, structures designed to hold under conditions that would break something lesser. The work teaches you something about load bearing, about which materials you can trust and which ones you can't, and what it costs to find out the hard way. I still have the 2009 Silverado. I still cut my own grass. I still buy the butter tarts from the Granville bakery and wrap them in wax paper because that's how Helen taught me. My granddaughter calls me Pop. That is more than enough. I've thought a lot about that moment at the kitchen sink, the tap still running, the water going cold over my hands while I stood there listening to two people I trusted reduce 11 years of sacrifice to a line item in a financing deal. And here's what I keep coming back to. I wasn't destroyed by what I heard. I was clarified by it. That's not something I could have said in my 40s. In my 40s, I would have warped around that corner and said something I couldn't take back. I would have made it loud and ugly, and I would have felt righteous for about an hour and then hollow for a month. But 68 years of living teaches you something, if you're paying attention. It teaches you that the most powerful response to betrayal is not the one that makes the most noise. It's the one that holds. What I did in the days after that ferry ride home, calling my lawyer, sitting quietly through Christmas dinner, keeping every conversation away from money and toward memory, that wasn't passivity. People might look at it that way from the outside. Some might even say I should have confronted them directly, made it a scene, demanded an accounting. But I think there's a kind of intelligence that only comes from knowing yourself well enough to know what you actually want. And what I wanted was not a war. What I wanted was a daughter, whether I could still have one. That was the real question, and it required patience, not volume. Helen used to say that character is what you do when you're tired and no one's watching. She said it about the children she taught. She was a school librarian for 22 years, but I think she meant it more broadly. I think she meant it as a description of the whole project of being a person. You build it slowly, over decades, in the choices that feel small at the time you don't cut a corner, the time you tell the truth when a comfortable lie was available, the time you stand at a kitchen sink and make a decision about who you intend to be. My daughter made choices too. I don't exempt her from that. She is old enough to know the difference between loving someone and using them, and somewhere along the way, she let those two things blur together, and that is on her, not only on her husband. But she is also her mother's daughter. There is something in her that knows better. I heard it when she cried on the phone. I saw it when she showed up at Christmas without him. That part of her is worth staying for. My granddaughter is 2 years old, and she calls me Pop, and she steals whipped cream off my plate without a trace of guilt, and she has no idea yet that the world will ask hard things of her, that it will put her in rooms with people who want something from her, and that she will have to learn, slowly, the way everyone does, how to tell the difference between love that costs the other person something and love that is really just appetite wearing a familiar face. I can't protect her from all of it, no one could, but I can be there steadily, in a way that shows her what it looks like to keep your footing when the ground shifts. I can be the kind of man she remembers when she's in a hard room someday and needs to know what holding looks like. That's the only inheritance worth leaving as far as I'm concerned. Not the trust, not the accounts, not the house in East Vancouver with the glow-in-the-dark stars still on the ceiling. Just the example just the evidence that it's possible to be knocked sideways by the people you love most and still find your way back to standing. The butter tarts are still wrapped in wax paper. Some things you don't stop doing